Well, thank you very much for joining us again for our National Divorce Debate Series, where we're interviewing lawyers, professors, scholars, thought leaders about what's going on in America and what it possibly could mean. Today, with me, it's my honor to have Don Livingston, professor, formerly retired from Emory University. I've known him for many years. Let me show you the introduction we have set up. Make sure that's showing. Okay, perfect. So, Professor Livingston has appeared on American History TV on C-SPAN. He's written articles for Mises Daily, Secession, a Specific American Principle. He's also author or co-author of a book called The Annotated Secessionist Papers. Professor Donald Livingston is the founder of the Abbeville Institute, a retired professor of philosophy at Emory University. He has been a National Endowment Independent Studies Fellow and a Fellow for the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. His books include Hume's Philosophy of Common Life and Philosophical Melancholy and Delirium and Hume's Pathology of Philosophy. A little bit about the Abbeville Institute. It was founded in 2002 in an effort to preserve the history and culture of the American South. Our efforts are to view the South's history through an academic lens to help others understand the rich traditions and culture that was born here. A little bit about some of the articles that he's written. Secession, a specifically American principle, and a separate title, but I think they're basically getting at the same thing, the secession tradition in America. A lot of talk about the UN Charter determines that you have the right of self-determination for different peoples. And then I wanted to ask you about a conversation that I had with Professor Klein. But before we get to all that, did I say anything wrong about your introduction? Did I get something incorrect? Is there something you'd like to point out about your bio, your background, your history before we get started, Professor?
No, that was okay. There was one book that I annotated. I don't know how that got in, but I don't know about it. But anyway, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
No, it's probably not your fault. Things on the internet come up, you never know what people do.
We always try to promote people and make them look the best. So I always try to find stuff they didn't, and you were listed with it.
It looks fine.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's get to the meat and potatoes. Professor, you've been part of the Abbeville Institute. We met years ago. I was able to go to the Texas conference that Abbeville Institute put on nullification. It was a great time. I met a lot of people. But that was a couple years ago, maybe 5 to 7 years ago. Recently, we've had Marjorie Taylor Greene, a sitting Congress member, say that there needs to be a national divorce between red and blue, conservative, liberal, however you call it. And she said it on President's Day. How would you interpret her call for a national divorce? And if you could wrap it up in an answer of, has political division gotten better in the last couple of years? Has it gotten worse? What are your thoughts, Professor?
Well, I think she's articulating something that Americans all over the country feel in their bones, whether they articulate it as a division of red and blue states or not. In other words, the polls show that people think America is coming apart in many ways, that we might be seeing a civil war of some kind in the foreseeable future. These are fears. Whether grounded or not we can debate, but they're there. And she's articulating that. I might just mention polls. I've been looking at polls since I got interested in secession after the Soviet Union broke up through peaceful secession. And that astonished everyone, including me. So I started looking into it, and that became a topic I did research on, secession in general. In 2017, a Zogby poll found that 39% of American voters would like their state to secede, and 29% they said they weren't sure. That's 68% that are willing to think about it. Only 30% thought war would be justified in holding the Union together. A few years later, a YouGov poll in 2021, in June, July, ask this question. Not would you like your state to secede, but would you like your region to secede? New England, the Pacific West Coast, the South, and so on. And of Republicans, 66% would like their region to secede. People might be frightened about their state seceding, but a region, the culture they know and understand, they feel more secure about. So 66%. Of Pacific Coast Democrats, it was 47%. And of Midwest and Democrats, it was 43%. So those are substantial numbers that register a discontent, not with this or that policy, not with left and right policies, but with the relation between the people in their states and regions and that remote thing called Washington, D.C. That is a paradigm shift. We have not talked that way since the mid-19th century. We've talked about policies, but we have not talked about structural territorial divisions. And now we're doing it.
I believe this is the poll you're talking about. It came out about 2 years ago, Brightline Research, and it shows, 66% of conservatives in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district open to secession. And when we go to the West Coast, it's 47% of Democrats. And then I found the Zogby poll you were mentioning. 38. Yeah, there's a significant percentage who are willing to have their state secede. Why? So what grabbed me was that when Marjorie Taylor Greene, well, first two things. Marjorie Taylor Greene is in Congress and talks about secession. Ted Cruz is a senator in Congress and talks about secession. To my knowledge, the last time that we had people in Congress, sitting senator, sitting Congress member, talking about secession was right before the Civil War.
That's right. That's right.
You'd have to go that far back to find anybody in the government going, I'm officially in Congress, I'm an actually duly elected person, and I'm talking about secession. We haven't really seen that about 150, 160 years. Is that fair?
Yes. And not only that, but one needs to consider the following. First of all, and this is a contentious issue, but I think it's true. A claim I'm making is true. Prior to as of 1860, everybody knew America was a federation of sovereign states. Let that soak in. That's like the European Union. The European is a federation of sovereign states. It is not a nation. Italy's a nation, but European Union is not a nation. America was not a nation in 1860. It was a federation of states. There were no rules even to handle the national flag. It wasn't a national flag. It was a flag of an office of government. There's a Coast Guard flag, but that's not the American flag. That's a flag of an office of the Navy. So the EU flag is not a national flag. It's the flag of an office of government in the Federation. Now, that's what America was in 1860. We have retrospectively read back the post-Civil War Union victory. We read that back into the minds of Americans from 1776 to 1860. And that's simply a distortion.
We've talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what happened. Since Americans believed that the country could divide, of course, not everybody wanted that to happen. It did not divide. And so what was established was a modern unitary state where the central government was supposed to have supreme power. Now, notice no argument was given for that. The Supreme Court took it up in Texas versus White. It's a very weak and flimsy opinion, and it's just an over the dicta opinion anyway. But the Supreme Court has not discussed secession or nullification in any serious way from Texas versus White right on up until today. So Americans just said, well, the war settled it.
Right.
The war settled it. Do you want to go back and fight again? No. So let's just don't talk about it. So nobody talked about it. So it's not as if it's unconstitutional. That's never been seriously looked at. And the proof
Yeah.
of that is a book. I'll just mention this book. It's by Sanford Levison. It's called Secession and Nullification in Modern. Oh well, I get it mixed up. It's secession and nullification in modern
In
America.
modern constitutional thought.
Yeah, modern constitutional thought. And Levison says we haven't really raised this question. He said lawyers don't have the faintest idea how to think about secession. He's alarmed about it. Levinson's worried about it, but he realizes that legal scholars, are going to have to take this up. And so he invited scholars to write articles for this book, which he edited. And and some are good, some are, but I mean, they're trying to understand how to think about this. And so that confirms what you're saying, that we haven't really talked about this for over 150 years. And now there's beginning to be some serious talk about it, even among legal scholars.
Is it fair to say, and I don't want to stay focused on this, but so there is a Supreme Court ruling called Texas versus White. You would agree?
Yes.
And it was by the actual Supreme Court, and it came after the Civil War, which makes it legal precedent, not the war, according to the way American law works. And it was decided by Salmon P. Chase, who was directly appointed by Abraham Lincoln himself.
Yeah.
And in that ruling, whether it was not the focus of the case or whatever, it is the only Supreme Court case to mention secession at all in American legal history. And it does say you can secede with consent of the states. Is that correct?
It does say that. You're right.
And don't we do live, I've heard other lawyers say, well, it's an offhand comment, but my understanding of the American law is that you have to go on previous cases. You can't ignore previous cases and say, I don't want to look at that. If it was decided before, you have to look at that.
Yeah. Yeah, they look at it, but they can also say it was wrongly decided.
Fair enough. And we've seen this recent Supreme Court overturn a couple decisions with like decades of precedent.
Yeah. So, but let me give you one other example. George Kennan. You remember George Kennan? Do you know anything about him? He's one of the memorable men of the 20th century. Some have called him the conscience of America. He helped frame the Cold War policy, or the
That's right.
containment policy. In 1993, he wrote he wrote an autobiography called Around the Cragged Hill, and he argues that the United States has simply grown too large for Republican government, and we should begin a public debate. This is 1993, a public debate on how to divide it, for the sake of Republican government. It's the argument that it's too large. This is an argument people don't pay attention to much, but corporations become too large. And there's a thing called downsizing, and you downsize the corporation. A person can become too fat. They just become morbidly obese. They need to be downsized. And this is not what Republicans and conservatives call limited government or shrinking big government. All they mean is reducing the rate of increase. We're talking about territorial divisions, territorial jurisdictions. And Kennan says this should not happen unless people want it to happen. So what we need is an honest, open debate about whether the thing is too large. Not just the central government, but the whole regime. And if so, we should begin talking about how to divide it. Now, this doesn't mean that we're divided up into completely billiard ball sovereign states. It might mean that, but it also might mean that powers would be recalled by the states and regions, so that the central government would have very little to do other than defense and commerce. So this is a very thoughtful man in 1993 calling for a debate on secession, and you see now it's gradually happening.
I had no idea this was written. I consider myself an expert in this space. I had no idea this was written. I had no idea that somebody of that pedigree, that much experience with the federal government, that much allegiance to America, also said, hey, it might be better for America.
And it's because he has all that in that book. He explains he has all this experience, and it's not working.
Right. I mean, he would be someone to say. He was at the epicenter of power for a long time. He actually got some things done with the federal government. Some people would say he's very successful working the organs of government. And then for him to say, you know, I can see the limitations of that system. I pushed it as far as we could. We did what we could to stop the Cold War. But I could also see the limitations using that system. I mean, he's in a position. He reminds me of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the defense advisor to like 3 different American presidents during the Cold War. And when he retired, he went to Europe and he did an interview where he said, basically, Americans are too dumb to have the amount of power that they have. The American population has no idea of the outside world. They have no interest in the outside world. They don't want to hear about it. They think that they're exceptional to everything. And all that does is allow policymakers in Washington, D.C. to do whatever they feel like, because the public have no idea to call into question. And that was from the guy who advised 3 different presidents to get us through the Cold War. So I'm seeing a pattern of people who worked at these high levels of the federal government going, it doesn't work, folks.
Well, here's another example. And a lot of people don't know this. The idea that a modern state was formed in the 17th century, roughly. You see it with the Treaty of Westphalia.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's we call it the billiard ball state. It's a sphere. It can't be divided. It's one and indivisible. So we say the pledge, one and indivisible. So they were all one and indivisible. And so you didn't talk about secession until the first country really start pursuing this was the Soviet Union. In 1977, the Soviet Union amended its constitution to lay out the conditions for the secession of a Soviet state. They actually did it, and you can read it by looking at the Constitution. In 1990, they upgraded that amendment, or changed, modified it, and made things more explicit. And then in 1991, they actually acted upon it. States actually invoked the amendment, and 15 states peacefully seceded. And Gorbachev got on television and announced the lawful dissolution of the Soviet Union. It didn't collapse. It went through a democratic process, a federal process, and was dissolved legally. Now, that was the biggest, I would say, the biggest democratic revolution in modern history. When has that ever happened before?
I think you'd have to go back into ancient history. Maybe like the medieval times, or maybe some during Bible times, to find some congregation of kings who maybe decided they could go. It'd be a really, 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 really stupidly long time ago before you found something like that again.
Yeah, and they did it, and so when that happened, notice this: that Kennan was over in the Soviet Union. He knew the Soviet Union like the back of his hand. He knew that secession amendment was there. It's 1977. And so Kennan could see that the Soviet Union was already realizing it was too big, dysfunctional, and it had to divide. And it was working out a legal way to do it that early. And so Kennan in 1993, once it had seceded, he says we should start a similar debate. But see, they started it, at least at the parliamentary level, in 1977.
So let's
we're a little behind.
Fair enough. And one of the things that I saw with the Soviet Union collapse was that people didn't necessarily, in America, the idea was that it is impossible to have a secession movement without mass violence. And that was the opinion until the Soviet Union collapsed with peacefully. And then they had to go, whoa, that was a gigantic confederation of nations, bigger than America. And they peacefully did it. I saw Americans never considered that secession might be able to be done in a peaceful, legal manner until they saw the Soviet Union do it. And I think the attitude was literally straight from the Civil War all the way up to 1990 was, you can't do secession, period, anywhere in the world, especially for a large conglomeration, piece of land,
Yeah.
lots of people, without violence. And then the Soviet Union shut that down hard with that one example. It's open for debate now.
And
Would you
it's
agree?
open for debate, and a number of with you, if you count the 15 Soviet states, it's over 20 states have peacefully seceded in Greater Europe, including Britain from the EU, and Scotland nearly seceded, and Quebec nearly seceded in 1995. As you know, there was a referendum, non-binding referendum in the Veneto in Italy, Lombardy in Italy, and in Catalonia in Spain for secession. One other thing I might mention is the Financial Times. The editor, I forgot his name, of the Financial Times a few years ago, said that what London needs is not a mayor, but a prime minister. Because London is larger than Ireland in population. It's an international city. It's not really English anymore. And it should secede and be an independent state like Singapore or the Hanseatic League states in the Middle Ages. But that's interesting. I mean, the Financial Times can just trot that out as something to think about.
I've heard that for New York City. That goes back to the 1980s, where you hear this periodically. New York City is so big and powerful, it could be its own country. It doesn't really need New York State. They can kind of do it on their own.
By the way, Kennan says that too. When he says, I don't know how to divide this thing, but he says, I could see 12 entities. He mentions regions, the South, New England, and so on. But then he says Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles should be city-states of their own.
They could survive as that. That's whether that's a good idea or not. They absolutely could survive as city-states. Those three examples. Yeah. He's not wrong with that. I want to ask you a quick question, but then I want to go back to Marjorie Taylor Greene. So I had heard something from a professor, and I wanted to hear your opinion on it. So if we're looking at Texas versus White, and it says consent to the states is a way to secede, and that was by Salmon P. Chase, who was appointed by Lincoln, one of the professors said, well, if you consider it this way, when they had 13 colonies to form America, they didn't have all 13 sign on. They had about 9, and then they go, good enough, we're moving forward. And the others had to join into what they already agreed. So if you didn't have to have everybody agree to form the union.
No, you don't.
Then maybe you don't have to have everybody agree to leave the union.
Here's the constitutional difference. In Britain, power is centralized. The king and parliament is supreme. The king and parliament, as they used to say, can do anything not impossible, naturally impossible. So the king and parliament could abolish free speech tomorrow. Whether it could do it politically is another question, but constitutionally it can do it. And it did it during the Gulf War. I mean, the Falkland War. They just shut down any talk about it or any news about it.
Wow.
And so remember when the colonies were making noise and talking about secession, the what was it? The Clarification Act. I may get the title wrong. The British government said that the British government can bind the colonies in, quote, all cases whatsoever. But the way the British have handled that is they say, yeah, we have absolute power, but we shouldn't always exercise it. So the debate is, for example, in Scotland, should we let Scotland have a referendum? If we say no, they can't do it unless they want to revolt and fly the black flag of revolution. They just can't do it.
Right.
But if Parliament says yes, then they can have a referendum. So what the British have done is they've treated their absolute power with moderation. Now, America has a totally different constitution. Its constitution was based on the people being sovereign, and the locus of that were the states. So the states were formed the Articles of Confederation. Well, first they were colonies, and they made themselves into states. Each made itself into a state, and then one independence. Then they formed a the articles, and remember the articles say that each state, quote, retains its freedom, sovereignty, and independence. In other words, they are sovereign political states, each one. So there is no central government that can give them permission to leave. So if they decide to leave, it's 9 sovereign states agreeing with each other. Can we do this? And they say, yes, we'll do it. Okay, then let's do it. And they just leave. And that leaves 4 states on their own under the Articles. So we had 2 federations. We had the United States and the Confederate States under 4 states. And Madison described them as our erring sisters, which we hope, quote, that there will be a, quote, reunion. We hope there'll be a reunion, but they don't have to.
Right.
See, now that kind of thing couldn't go on in Britain. Scotland just can't leave.
Right.
It can leave by permission. So American states don't need any permission to leave. So one state today could say, look, we're a sovereign state. Doesn't matter what Texas says versus what. We're seceding. They send commissioners to Washington to negotiate a separation, just as Britain did to the EU. And Washington could say, no, you're not going to leave. We'll send in troops. Well, okay, then it's got to be war. So the state might decide, well, we won't leave. I would recommend that. If a single state wanted to do that, I would say, well, okay. But that would be war. Now, would Washington do that? It might with one state. But if the west coast of the Pacific West Coast leaves, just does this, sends commissioners to negotiate, because they have to negotiate. You can't just leave. You have to negotiate. But if they're willing to do that, will Washington send troops or will it negotiate? And we don't know. That is a question of sovereignty.
I believe it was Thomas Jefferson, and I'm trying to find it, but I believe 1813, a letter from Thomas Jefferson, where he said that there should be a Republic of the Pacific, great, free, and independent empire populated by American settlers, but separate from the United States politically and economically, and eventually becoming a great trading partner, exploring its own democratic partner. 1813, Thomas Jefferson said, America is going to be far too big if it goes to the West Coast and incorporates those states. Better to just leave the West Coast states separate, let them not even join America. It'll be too large.
Yeah, exactly. And that's Kennan's point. Kennan's just restating in 1993 what Jefferson said in 1813.
So we have Madison talking about it. We have Thomas Jefferson talking about it. And then you can go forward to Kennan talking about it. These are patriots. These are people who love America. They're not here to destroy America. And yet they're looking at it and going, maybe separation would allow for better governance. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, absolutely. Here's one way to think about this. This is a philosophical point. What is political reality? What is Republican reality? Well, the Greeks invented republics, pretty much, and the Romans had them, and they were all over the place in the ancient world. Now, what Aristotle argues is that you can't have Republican government unless it's small. And the small is relative, so you have to explain what you mean by that. But I'll just say this, that Athens had around 300,000 people, if you include slaves, foreigners, children, everybody, around 300,000. And that was one of the largest states in Greece. Now think about it. Greek civilization was made up of around 1,500 little republics. There was no central authority. 1,500 little republics, most of them were smaller than Greece. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. And yet the Greeks built a brilliant civilization. We still study their philosophy, their literature, their architecture with these little states. So you do not need a large state for high culture. You can develop a high culture with very small states. You might need it for defense, or you might need it for ease of commerce. That's another thing. But if you do that, then you should federate small states into the larger entity. Don't just centralize everything. You have to have a kind of federation. If you have a federation, the larger it gets, the more likely you're going to have intractable interests. And the larger it gets, the more important it is to have a rule of secession, like the EU does. It's just too big. But if you're small, like Switzerland, they're highly decentralized.
Right.
26 states have sovereignty. One of them is so small, Appenzell, Innerrhoden, has only 16,000 citizens. Get that, 16,000, yet they can veto a constitutional amendment. Because
according to The Economist magazine, which is a magazine that studies countries around the world and geopolitics, Switzerland has the highest level of democracy of any country operating on Earth. So it backs up what you're saying. You get smaller, you get smaller, you get smaller. These people are experiencing a level of democracy and accountability of their elected officials that would seem like unicorns had landed here in America. And they could have that every day when we don't.
Yeah, you can't do anything in Switzerland by the central government. It's very hard to do. I mean, you've got so many barriers you have to jump over. For example, women did not get the right to vote in Switzerland until 1971. I think it was 71, and that was only in certain territories. They didn't totally get it on the local level to 1991, and it was little Appenzell Innerrhoden that held out, but they just had to put up with it.
I just check out Switzerland, folks. Check out Sweden. They have really high levels of democracy that seem like dreams to what we have, and they're able to pull it off. I wanted to ask you this question, though, because we had some of the viewers asking this question. And this is something I've asked some of the other professors. I'm trying to get more professors with a background in economics to answer this. But basically, this question. When Marjorie Taylor Greene said, let's have a national divorce, red separate from blue, a lot of the commentary in the mainstream media from Fox News, like Laura Ingraham, and from MSNBC, Joy Reid, so right and left, was, you stupid, imbecilic red states. You take more money from the federal government than us blue states. We're donor states, and you are welfare queens. And if you leave us, you'll lose all this money, and then you'll immediately die in an economic swamp. How stupid of you. Is that a fair assessment of how these red states, if they left, theoretically would do just automatic economic ruin because they've lost the largesse from the federal government, no options to improve their economy at all?
Well, I think poor states in those states have seceded. Look at Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia. They seceded. What kind of economy do they have? They were very, but they pulled themselves together and did it. First of all, we can't just talk about Georgia leaving or any state leaving. A certain thing, we have to go through Kennan's debate. We have to debate this. This has to be thought through. And if it's thought through, it might well be that some of these states, red states she's talking about, when they look at things, they might say, no, we're not going to do this. This wouldn't work. We do want to stay. I mean, that just might happen. So if the people begin debating it, they might conclude that it's not worth it. And I can easily imagine some states concluding that. On the other hand, if they have the spirit of independence, if they think their culture is being assaulted, that their way of life is being hollowed out by powerful forces, and they have the spirit of independence, it won't stop them. It doesn't matter how poor they are, they'll withdraw. Singapore was very poor. It pulled out of the Malaysian Federation. How could that little city-state survive? But look at it now.
You're bringing up some great questions, and this is some great points, and this is one of the things I've tried to get some people to ask was, okay, you're leaving the federal government, theoretically, you lose federal largesse. And yeah, that could take a hit on your economy. But you'd also be free from federal regulations.
That's right.
And you would be able to do tax policy, corporate policy, business policy in a manner that could be very attractive to governments. We had a president called Donald Trump who tried to make America's tax policy more favorable for American corporations to come back to America. He was shut down hard by the federal government for doing that. So it's not like we haven't tried and seen how this totally fails. You cannot do massive regulatory reform and improving your economy, lowering tax rates at the federal level just isn't going to happen. So my question was, if these red states left, there's a little place called Puerto Rico. I consider it a colony of America. You don't pay federal income taxes there. It's the only place American citizens can go to, keep all their rights, and not pay federal income taxes. Because of that, they've attracted massive amounts of investment out of America to Puerto Rico, and it is now the highest income economy in all of Latin America. Still poor by American standards, but massively densely wealthy compared to all of Latin America. Well, before you answer, one more example. There's a country called Ireland. And Ireland was a poor backwater, basically colony of England for the last 100 years. And then somewhere around the 70s or 80s, they go, we're going to make ourselves the most attractive place for corporations. We'll have the lowest corporate tax rate. In fact, many of the largest corporations in California, basically the largest companies in the world, aren't headquartered in California. They're headquartered in Ireland. Our governor famously went to Ireland to complain about how much tax money we were losing because these companies from Silicon Valley were going to Ireland paying taxes there. Ireland got all the money and we got nothing. So knowing that, couldn't these red states theoretically have a no federal income tax, lowest corporate income tax rate in the entire planet and suck out investment from blue state America and the rest of the planet, as we've seen Puerto Rico and Ireland do?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You made, when you gave a talk at our conference in Dallas, some years ago, you made that point very well. I was impressed by it. You described the things that could be done without the federal government. And of course, foreign investment would be attracted. And so that's what people would do. If they're really strapped economically, there are ways to get out of it. One of the interesting things about economic growth is it can happen very rapidly. Remember the miracle in Germany after World War II in total shambles. And then in 5 years or something, it was amazing what had happened. Human beings are like ants. You tear down their anthill and they just start working day and night. And pretty soon that anthill is right back up again. So all of these red states, if they had the will to be independent, that's the thing. If they don't have the character, and see, some of these states, like Ireland did not have the entrepreneurial character. It was not a capitalist state. It was a Catholic, laid-back, welfare-type mentality state. It was a buddy system. Everything was worked on the buddy system, sort of.
Right.
So, but they looked at they changed, and that can happen.
So backing you up on economic growth can happen quickly. You're right. Germany, Japan after World War II, but my other favorite examples are Brazil around 2010 and China around 1995. Those
Brazil's amazing.
Yeah, they made political decisions that they were going to start operating very differently than they had in the past. Like, oh, this is the way we used to do. That's going away. China did it. Brazil did it. So there was a big policy shift, and then their economies exploded. It wasn't that they got lucky or found some oil reserves. They said, we're going to change the way we think about business radically, not a little bit, and their economies exploded. So you can have growth in new economies by having a different philosophy about economics. Is that fair?
Yes, and it would be easier in the red states because they all have a capitalistic history, an entrepreneurial history, a Protestant work ethic. They all have that. Whereas China was communist. It was absolutely opposed to all of that, and yet they thought, well, we're tired of being poor. We're gonna figure out how to do it, and we're going to do it our way. We're going to keep the Communist Party, but we're going to be capitalists on the other way. So they probably have gone too far. I don't know. I don't know if they can handle all they've done.
One last question about economics. This is something that occurred to me. I'm not seeing anybody in the news bring it up, but NAFTA is an international agreement between Mexico, America, and Canada. NAFTA allows Mexican truckers to drive from Mexico right through the border, right through all of America on I-35 and up into Canada. So we already have transportation between different foreign nations for a trade alliance.
Yeah.
Why couldn't independent southern states just sign on to NAFTA. Like I was part of America. I'm now a different group, but I'm signing on to the same paperwork. Everything you guys already agreed to, I just agreed to, and I'm automatically back in NAFTA. What's to stop that from happening?
Nothing. No.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I can't get anyone to say that. It's just these people are so idiots. If they leave, it's the end of the world. There won't be any trade in America. And I go, if they sign on to NAFTA, they're right back in the same trade agreement with all the same rules. There'd literally be no disruption at all. And we know NAFTA can be re-agreed. And we know that you can have countries travel across international borders because we have Mexican citizens coming into America all the time as part of NAFTA.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Let me just say one thing. The reason why you say the idiot responses, and I think they are dull, but I think what's behind it is they're not thinking economically. They just don't want America to break up. They are nationalists. I mean, and this is understandable. This is such a shocking idea that America would break up, that they need to find a reason to prevent it. So one of the debate that Kennan's talking about has to do, I had this feeling myself when I first started thinking about this back early 1900s. I was nervous about it, and but I had to work through the objections I had, many of which were visceral, to see things in a clearer way. And people are going to have to go through that. And what you're doing and what Kennan suggested we should do is begin a national debate, a calm, rational national debate. And if it doesn't work for some people, we won't do it. Keep the United States. It's 50 states. You do well with 30 states, will be fine.
That's what I've said. That's what I've said is that the difference between what made America great versus China and Russia and other totalitarian countries is, if you want quick performance and quick results, totalitarianism is the way to go.
Yeah.
But it creates long-term instability because you're not allowed to talk about certain things. The black people don't get to protest how they're treated by police. So it just stays hidden until one day they blow up and rage. Same thing with Latin people, same thing with Social Security issues. And so because we are allowed to have these awkward conversations that don't make us look super smooth and doesn't allow us to move very quickly, we're not at risk of these massive social upheavals. I mean, Putin's at risk of having a protest just swarm his government any day. The Chinese are constantly locking people up because they're afraid they're going to get a mass protest. They're denying these awkward conversations, and that makes them unstable. I thought what made America stable was that we could engage and have discussions and see where they went and had free speech. Just my opinion. Let's go to another question. Because I want to get to something else. But one of the responses to Marjorie Taylor Greene was, well, there were two main responses. We don't need to be split up by, red and blue states, even staying in the Union, and we don't need secession. We don't need either one of those, any sort of division. There's no real division. She's making the division. What we need is marriage counseling. This was said by a Utah governor, and it was posted all over the media. We don't need national divorce. We need marriage counseling. Professor, what does marriage counseling look like for 200 to 300 million people who have been the most polarized they've been for over 15 years? And you have to go back 160 years to see a level of polarization. Who can save the marriage? Who comes forward and does this marriage counseling to get us all back together? Is it Joe Biden?
Well, what is one to say? I think he's using a metaphor, and I think the metaphor is just inappropriate. I'm trying to figure out in what sense America is a marriage. The pledge, one and indivisible, might look like a marriage in the sense that we're tied together for good or ill forever. Okay, so if that's the case, then maybe there should be some sort of discussion about our national unity, and that could be called a kind of marriage counseling. But I don't. I mean, at that point, the metaphor just breaks down. When you start asking yourself, who's the counselor? Who are you going to bring in as a counselor? And you got 50 states, and the states can't talk, so you have to find out who's going to. It gets very complicated. I think a better way to look at it, I would say this: what we need is a family intervention.
Okay.
Now, family intervention is a different thing. And by that I mean, if the states begin to recover their sovereignty, they can just intervene. They can intervene like California did. California refused to acknowledge the validity of the prohibition against medical marijuana that Congress had passed and the Supreme Court had upheld.
Right.
And they said, well, we're just going to do it anyway, and you come in and enforce it. They didn't say the law was unconstitutional. They didn't show contempt for the Supreme Court. They just said we're a sovereign state. And there are 5 cases, the anti-commandeering cases, which say the state does not have to support the federal government in enforcing one of its laws. So the ATF did not have the manpower or money to enforce it in California. Well, then the signal went to other states. Well, what about recreational marijuana? Could they enforce that? No, they couldn't. So then it spread, and now I think most people today in Alabama, Mississippi, and places that don't approve, have not approved of medical marijuana even, believe that it's up to the states to decide. Now think about that. It's up to the states to decide, not the Supreme Court or the Congress. And so some of these states have voted to have recreational marijuana. The feds still have the law on their side, and so you can't use credit cards to buy pot. You have to do cash. So we have this situation where the states have intervened, have recalled their powers. The federal government, they played hardball, and the federal government could not enforce its own law because it doesn't have the manpower and money to do it. It relies on the state law enforcement. And so the states are winning the battle on whether the states have authority over marijuana or the central government.
That's what you mean by family intervention.
Yeah, I'll just call that a family intervention. The states, let's say we're a big family.
Yeah. Yeah.
50 members of the family, and it's their family resemblances. I mean, some states don't look like you have a family resemblance. You got the cousin with the big ears, just like
You
got one with red hair, then you got a sort of bastard in there with red hair, but they're all part of the family. But if California intervened and asserted itself, and then the other members of the family said, well, we're going to do that. And then the federal government said, no, you're not, but you couldn't enforce it. So suppose states started doing that, then that would clarify constitutionally, in a political way, clarify what the rights of the federal government are and the states to some degree. It wouldn't solve things, but.
So that sounds like, and I want to come back to the marriage counseling question, but that sounds like federalism. That was the other response. We don't need national divorce. We need federalism. So let me present something to you, and I'd like to get your response. This is what I've asked all the professors. For decades, the Republican Party has talked about federalism. It's the way to do it. We're all about federalism. Okay.
Yeah.
Then there was this thing called Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Yeah.
And they didn't remove the right of a woman's access to abortion. They passed it back to the states. I'm in California. Nobody interpreted that as power to the states. They interpreted it as they're taking away our rights to have a woman's right to abortion. Now, I knew that wasn't true. The power was reserved to the states. Everybody was going to be fine in California. But you basically didn't see anybody on the left go, hey, states' rights, we got our power.
That's right. That's right.
And then on the other side, Mike Pence, top Republican vice president, after they returned Roe v. Wade, power to the states, goes, maybe returning power to the states isn't good enough. Let's have a national abortion ban. He was not criticized by Republicans, and he was supported by some. So if you have one political party completely reject returning it to the states, and then you have the other political party that said federalism for years, and then completely contradict themselves the first time they actually get a gigantic amount of federalism, what hope is there for real federalism to return to America?
Well, I don't know the future. I don't know the future. However, federalism is a strange kind of system in a way. I mean, it's always in tension because the question is who has the authority, the central authority or the states. And since they're sovereign states, and since the central government has real powers, you play hardball. And so California played hardball with the federal government and won. And a number of other states sided with California. So that is federalism. And
Sure.
so I think that in the future, federalism will always be that way. There will always be this sort of tension. And if the states get out of hand somehow with abortion, I don't know if they get crazy. I don't know what say they start having an infanticide. You could just, like the Romans, you had the father had 5 days to decide whether to let the kid live or not. I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
Then maybe then people won't. Well, we need a national solution to this, but I don't know the answer. I think federalism is always that way. And what I think, the reason I mentioned the family intervention is one thing it would do. See, Americans are not awakened to the idea that states can do things. That they're not really keen to that. They're used to thinking of the national government doing everything. So they've got to get used to thinking of people of states like California acting. They got to start doing that. Once they do that, then they'll be more open to secession because they can see that it could be real. But we have to get over some of these myths that have kept us from being even federalists.
A lot of the suggestions I see is, if we go back to federalism, something around the time of right after they signed the Constitution, where you had a massive delegation of powers to the states and a very small federal government, that we could be intact. But I'm just curious, is it realistic to assume that this federal government's going to optionally give up that much power, give up all the powers it's built up over the last century so we can get to a more fair plane of existence among the states?
I don't know. I can't imagine that the central government will delegate power. See what the British did, British Empire, everything was centralized. So the British gave home rule to Ireland, gave home rule to its colonies, India, gradually home rule, a little bit of home rule, more home rule, and then finally independence. So it was phased out gradually by central authority. What has to happen in America is that the states have to recall it. That's the political act that has to go on. You cannot expect this. First of all, central government, well, it has usurped power. It can give it back. So, for example, the Supreme Court usurped the powers of the states to regulate abortion. Then it gave the power back.
Right.
But so that we would like for that to happen, but the motive for it to happen is something like California intervening. You see?
I see.
And so the states have to recall, the language has to be, you never had it legitimately in the first place, unless it was defense or whatever the delegated powers were that you think they were. We're recalling this. And so we're doing it. We're just acting. We're just assuming this power now. And this has to be done incrementally, and it has to be done prudently. It has to be done in a politically wise way, as California did, and get support of other states. That's the way it will have to happen, I think.
Here's the next question. But before we do that, I heard the Utah governor say marriage counseling, and I just kept thinking, who's that going to be? Joe Biden ran on being the decent America, the return to decency. He also said during the campaign trail, and the media picked this up, there was going to be a national calming. Republicans were going to come back together with the Democrats. We were going to reunite. He was going to tone down the polarization of Trump. That was before January 6th. That was before Joe Biden decided to go on TV with a blood red backdrop, active duty Marines, and say 78 million Americans are enemies of the state. Who who's going to do marriage counseling if we have presidents that are this divisive? I mean, Trump was massively divisive for the left, but I don't think Biden was any better either. I mean, that speech saying 78 million Americans are enemies of the state, that was exceptionally divisive. So
Sure.
if we have presidents who can't do the job, who can be the marriage counselor for 200 to 300 million people when the last two people completely failed?
Yeah. Well, you've made a very good point. The rhetoric, the political rhetoric, and the fact that it's rhetoric doesn't mean that it doesn't have substance, is such that you can't have rational discourse. I mean, you can't have rational discourse if 78 million Americans are enemies of the state.
Right.
It can't happen. You've closed off all negotiation.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that is the rhetoric we're using. And Thomas Hobbes said that he was afraid of his own rhetoric.
Hobbes said that?
Wow. Said he was afraid of his own rhetoric. He wrote very boldly.
Yeah, I'm afraid of Hobbes' rhetoric. Read his book if you want to not sleep for a week.
That's right. He was afraid of his own rhetoric. So I'm afraid we should be afraid of our own rhetoric today, because we've crossed lines. We've crossed some lines that some people can't walk back. Right now, we've crossed them.
That's a great point. But I don't want to use up all your time, so I want to go to this question. We got this from Professor Klein. He asked that we ask you. So I was talking to Professor Daniel Klein. I was asking him, because he's an economics professor, if he could talk about the economic, possibilities of a separate red state, like I talked about with you. My main thought, though, on secession, this is from Professor Daniel B. Klein. My main thought is, though, that however desirable it may be, it's not something that opponents would ever permit, no more than Lincoln permitted secession. Hold on. To which I responded, but Lincoln did permit secession. He permitted secession by those who signed the contract. He only disavowed unilateral secession. He said in his inaugural address that if the Southern states approached Congress and there was a vote of the people, he would have to abide. Lincoln also appointed Selman Chase as the top Supreme Court justice personally. Chase also said in Texas versus White that states could not unilaterally secede, but they could secede with consent of the states. If red states approached Congress and asked for a vote, and a majority of Congress approved, could those red states then secede? He responded with, well, Lincoln would have known the out he permitted, about which I do not know anything more than you're right. Would it actually be feasible? Then there is the question of whether either Constitution or natural law, Lincoln's requirement, as you described it, is valid or just. I don't know a lot about that, but my inclination is against. See this book, Chaining Down the Leviathan. Don Livingston knows this work. I just feel in my gut that the opponents would put a stop to it one way or another. Here's the book, Chaining Down the Leviathan, The American Dream of Self-Government, 1776 to 1865. What is Daniel Klein getting at when he says, is secession by, I think, Texas versus White, consent to the states, even constitutional or natural law? And then he's bringing up this book.
Say that again. Is he asking what? Run that through again. About Dan Klein.
Well, Lincoln would have known that the out he permitted, about which I do not know anything more than you write, which is consent to the states, that's what I was telling him, wouldn't actually be feasible, right? So Lincoln would have known that the consent to the states option he permitted in his inaugural address wouldn't actually be feasible. Then there's the question of if secession by consent is either constitutional or natural law, Lincoln's requirement, was valid or just.
Well, I understood all that. I was asking. Well, here's what I would say about, as I understand what he's asking, or what he's assuming.
Yeah.
He says a contract was made with the states.
Okay.
And you can't break it unless all agree. Okay. That's not contract law. In contract law, there is no contract that does not admit of an equitable remedy of recession. And There's no perpetual contract. So the equitable remedy of secession is always available, especially with states that are sovereign. I mean, Britain did not need permission to secede from the EU. It did need permission to get what it wanted out of the EU, and there had to be good faith negotiations, but it didn't have to have the consent of the other states. You see, I mean, Britain did not ask for consent of the other states.
Right.
There was never a vote taken by the other states to say yes or no. It's just that Britain is going to leave. Well, there are international treaties that were signed, and Britain is under obligation, and the UE is under obligation. So they had to sort out the highways that the EU built in Britain, what they were worth, and all of this, and they did it. So again, he somehow is assuming some sort of indivisibility to a contract that doesn't exist, especially with sovereign states.
And this is why I brought up earlier that some of the professors had pointed out America became a union without everybody signing the contract, period. So if everybody has to sign the contract, then America's not valid, right? You had 9 out of 13 colonies sign on and they go, okay, we're in, and you guys can, and we're assuming the rest of you will come in whenever. That was not everybody signing the contract that was going to be part of this. That was a partial signatory. So why can't we do that again to leave? That's the argument that I've seen. I was wondering if you got.
Well, I would question that, because I think if you're dealing with sovereign, you're referring to individuals signing out, you and me signing it. That's what Lysander Spooner says. He never signed it, and I understand the force of that. But if we're dealing with sovereign states, with corporate entities, and they sign on in the way in which they do with their representatives and so on, then we have a compact. But it's open to rescission, and Washington said it's an experiment. He said, is it too large? People say it is. He says, but it's an experiment. Give it a chance. Well, how would you know the experiment was failing? It would be failing if states wanted to leave. That's when it would fail. Well, if it fails, then you'd negotiate a withdrawal. It was an experiment. He didn't say it was a compact. It was irrevocable. It required consent of everybody.
That's fascinating. I'm trying to find Lincoln's inaugural address where I could show you, but it was his inaugural address, and he did say that he could not let people go, but if the public decided through some means, like a vote, he would have to go along with that, and there isn't anything he could say about that. I'm having a little trouble finding.
Well, I can understand the position. See, I can understand the position that Lincoln would have. Look, he says the Union is indivisible unless the parties to the compact want it to divide, and this means it must be unanimous, because the consent was unanimous of the parties, not individuals, but the parties. So if it's going to divide, then it has to be unanimous. But that doesn't make sense. The EU is a compact. It was formed unanimously, but it doesn't require unanimous consent for a sovereign state within it, because it is a sovereign state, to withdraw and negotiate a separation. So
Right.
Both Klein, as far as I understand him, and Lincoln are building into a federation of states the logic of a modern state. And let me just say briefly what that is. It goes back to Hobbes. See, Lincoln and Hobbes and Webster and Story all give a Hobbesian account of the Union. What they say, what Story says is, when the colonies seceded from Britain, all British law disappeared in America, all of it. And that left an aggregate of individuals. In other words, America descended into anarchy when they seceded. You can kind of see how that makes a little sense.
Right.
No law at all, period. Why was there no law? Because they're not thinking of natural law. They're just thinking of positive law.
Right.
But that's not what happened. What happened is the colonies were already natural political societies. with allegiance to the crown. They separated the allegiance, but that didn't mean they were not still natural political societies, because for Aristotle, unlike Hobbes, for Aristotle, a political society is a naturally, historically developing thing, like a natural language. Whereas for Hobbes, a political society is an artificial thing with a central authority to prevent anarchy. So the British are thinking like Hobbes, and they have absolute total authority over every individual in the colonies because of central authority, whereas the colonies are thinking like Aristotle, and the British are thinking like Hobbes. And
Interesting.
Hobbes and Klein are thinking like Hobbes, and thinking of the American compact between the states is like a unitary state. So in Hobbes's view, when individuals form a political society, then they're out of anarchy. They're free of anarchy.
Right.
But now, if any one of them or any group wants to leave, then they're breaking the compact with every individual.
Right. And that's, if I may, that's what it looks like Lincoln was saying.
Exactly.
Here's his inaugural address. This is not the whole thing. These are excerpts. It's not the whole thing. But I want to call attention to a few words. Again, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of a contract merely, can it, as a contract, be peaceably unmade by less than all of the parties who made it? One party to a contract may violate it, break it, so to speak, but does it not require all to lawfully rescind it? The other quote here is, but if destruction of the Union by one or by a part only of the states be lawfully permissible, the Union is less perfect than before.
That's pure Hobbes. That's pure Hobbes.
Okay.
Here's another thing to reinforce that, Marcus. In one, I can't remember the reference exactly, but in one of his speeches to Indianapolis, I think, Lincoln compares the states to counties. He says, what is this special character of a state? He says, if a state and a county have the same amount of territory and people, there's no difference. Well, a man who can't tell the difference between a county and an American state is really not fit to be president.
I'll say this about Lincoln. My understanding was presidents don't interpret the law. The Supreme Court does. Presidents don't get to say, here's how I think the Constitution was meant. That's not your job. You are the executor of the laws passed by Congress. Congress passes laws. You make that stuff happen in your interpretation, but within the bounds of those laws passed. You are not the Supreme Court. And I have never seen anybody bring that up going, why is the president acting like the Supreme Court? That's in the Constitution. You're not supposed to do that. And I see all these lawyers come forward and go, this is solved. And I go, but what he did was unconstitutional by its very nature.
Yeah.
So a few more quotes. It follows from these views that no state upon its own mere motion can lawfully leave the Union. I shall perform its. Okay. I therefore consider that in my view, the Constitution and the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. Doing this, executing the laws faithfully, I see only as a simple duty on my part. I shall perform it so practicable, faithfully executing the laws on the states. He will perform it as practical unless my rightful masters, the American people, shall, within the requisite means or in some manner authority, direct the contrary. So I have to follow the laws. I will enforce these laws on these rebellious states unless the American people direct me to do the opposite. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that's left. The chief magistrates derives all of his authority from the people, and they have referred none upon him to fix terms for the separation of states. The people themselves can do this if they choose. So nobody told him, I'm okay with these states leaving here and here, so therefore I have to keep the Union together unless the American people tell me the opposite. In his inaugural address, when we look at Salmon Chase saying, yes, you can secede through consent of the states, it seems to say there's some sort of agreement of, We all signed a contract. No, you can't go. I'm out. I'm upset. I'm leaving. I'm not talking with you guys. But if you could perhaps reach some sort of negotiated settlement where everybody who signed onto the contract, I would argue not everybody, Lincoln seems to say everybody, then you could peacefully secede. That seems to be what he's saying, and what his personally appointed Supreme Court justice is also saying.
Yeah. Well, if that's what people accept,
right,
it,
right.
But the then what would this mean? You get a majority vote in every state. What would this mean? But see, he says here's a minority upsetting the majority. That's not the way to talk about it. That's a Hobbesian state. A Hobbesian state lifts people out of anarchy. Every single individual, whether they want to or not, they're out. They're in it. They consent in the sense that it's an offer they can't refuse,
right?
And which is to their self-interest. I mean, they can see that the alternative is anarchy, and they don't want that. So then, if a minority leaves a Hobbesian state, that is treason. I mean, that is because if you accept the logic of that, then there's no independent social authority within the state. Either the sovereign has to agree, or some mechanism has to get the will of whatever the sovereign is, if it's the people or a group of individuals in the central government. So he's perfectly right about that. However, if we're dealing with states, then we're not talking about minorities. Appenzell Innerrhoden in Switzerland has 16,000 people. That is a real minority of the 8 million in Switzerland. And yet it is a sovereign state. And when there's a constitutional federal law to be approved, there must be a majority of the cantons. And that one little canton can check a constitutional amendment. You see, it's not a minority, is it? It doesn't make any sense to talk about a minority. It's a sovereign state. It says no. And you say, wait a minute. All the states, all 20, a majority would have voted except for you. You're blocking the whole thing. Of course. That's what a sovereign state can do.
Yeah.
See, it's not a minority among an aggregate of individuals.
Right.
But in the Hobbesian regime, there's only the central government and an aggregate of individuals. That's the only political society there is. If they are states, they are counties. Lincoln says they're counties authorized by the American people via the Constitution. But that's not the logic of the Union. That's how he sees it.
Fair enough. Would it be fair to say
he's muddling up two kinds of language? The Aristotelian language and the Hobbesian language are all muddled up in that first inaugural.
I think what you're saying is in his first inaugural address, a lot of his logic is Hobbesian. You were saying that's straight Hobbes. That was very interesting. I didn't know that. But that would make sense. We're looking at 1860s. Hobbes was a big thought leader at that time. So
I'm analyzing subatomic physics behind the argument, so to speak. Okay. If you are an Aristotelian, you believe, let me put it very simply, and I hope this makes sense. If you're an Aristotelian, you believe that political societies are natural, like a natural language. They're not formed by compact. Nobody formed there are no founding fathers of the English language or the Spanish language. There's something we're born into. It's a natural social thing. A political society is the same thing, if it exists. The question was, are the colonies political societies? And the Americans said yes. And the British said no, you're just artificial constructions of central power. That's all you are, for the sake of the British government or the people. So what were the states? Lincoln says they're artificial counties. They're constructions of the American people, just like the Crown constructed the colonies for the British people, except we just have a different sovereign, the American people. And the Aristotelians will say, no, Virginia is a real political society. It wasn't constructed by anybody. It was constructed by Britain, but over time it became something else. Like a child grows up He's a man now. He's not, an adolescent. You have to talk to him in a different way. And so Virginia is a political society, the oldest parliamentary body in the Western Hemisphere, except for the Iroquois Federation.
Nice. Good reference.
And it has to be treated as a sovereign society. Lincoln is treating the states as counties, as artifacts of central power. And on that ground, he's right. I mean, it makes sense. But that's the Hobbesian regime. But America was not a Hobbesian. Britain was a Hobbesian regime, but America did not develop that way, and it did not think that way, and it did not develop a philosophy that way. And so Lincoln's at the middle, where you got both of these discourses going on, the Aristotelian, the Hobbesian, going on, and he's able to muddle through rhetorically.
Yeah, he was good at that, we'll say. And one second, New York and Vermont. Okay, so the last question I wanted to ask you was, is it easy to split up states? When I saw Marjorie Taylor Greene call for national divorce, and she says, well, I don't mean secession. I think she was open to that initially. She just had to walk it back. But she said, I just mean, state splits, splitting up the states, conservative, liberal populations. And a lot of the commentary in the news was, how could this even happen? How would you even do that? I can't even imagine how you think about states. How can we even contemplate it? And I spent 30 seconds on Google, and I found that states had split off from other states before in American history.
Yes.
Kentucky came from New York. Maine came from Massachusetts. Virginia
came from Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. But Maine came from Massachusetts, and New Hampshire was a quarter between New Hampshire and New York.
Yeah, so you have states, Kentucky from Virginia, Maine from Massachusetts, West Virginia from Virginia, Vermont from New York. You can even talk about Tennessee and I think Georgia, although it's not an exact case. So we've had states split up from other states at least 3 times. It's been done. It's legal precedent. We have the formation. Yeah. Let me show you this now, if I may. And this is something I was asking some of the professors. So if you look at Georgia, they're saying Georgia's purple. And not really. The blue portion of Georgia is all in Atlanta, the gigantic blue circle there. And then 90% of the landmass is basically red. Yeah, there's a few blue dots there, but what's really turning Georgia blue is that gigantic blue circle that's Atlanta, not the rest of it. We can go to Texas, look at the same thing. Texas, 90% red. There's something called the urban triangle between Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio, Austin. And if you connect those 3 in a triangle, which they have freeways to do, you have 90% of the land is rural. Yeah, there's a few blue dots here at the bottom, but basically it'd be a hardcore red state for the next 20, 30 years and a hardcore blue state. We can go to Illinois, same thing. Chicago, it's the only thing that makes it blue. We can go to Oregon, it's the top left corner. We can go to California. Conservatives are very dominant in the mountains and the top. And so I said, why can't we just split states like this? Like the Atlanta region's the new state, the rest is Georgia. The triangle, the urban triangle in Texas is a state with access to a port, the rest is Texas. Same thing with Illinois, same thing with Oregon. Why is it so hard to do that? Especially when we already have these states and they're already broken up into water and power districts where they have to supply the water and power every day, and they're already broken up into these regions. Here's the power district. Atlanta has its own. Here's the water district. Atlanta has 2 of those. You could literally just split up the district. Same thing. Texas has separate districts. Same thing with Illinois. Same thing with Oregon. So if we have state split boundaries by water, power, roads, etc., and we have states that have split before, and we can clearly see it's not purple. It's a few cities have an overwhelming amount of blue, and then the 90% of the rest of the landmass is conservative and would stay conservative for the next 20, 30 years. Would it be that hard to split these states up in roughly the manner that I showed, at least at a conceptual level?
At the conceptual level, it's clearly not. But, practically, it depends on the people and whether they really can do this or not. So, but it's an option that should be considered. That when we talk about secession, Marcus, there are all sorts of ways you can secede, all the way from absolute billiard ball independent states to federations, to regional federations, which is and to little states. I mean, Mussolini now allowed the Vatican to create a little theocratic state, the Vatican in Italy. It's a sovereign state created out of it. And, Florida, I don't know if people thought about this, but Disney World is a medieval city state.
I've heard that.
And what I mean by that, in the Middle Ages, a city could be both a business corporation and a government. So, in other words, they could be together. So, and that was true in America. City corporations and business corporations could work together and be part of each other. That began to change in the 19th century with the Lincolnian centralization kicked in, and then all the states started copying the worst features of federal centralization. They started doing that with their cities and counties and allowing cities to sprawl all over the place, whereas prior to that, little cities on the outside of a big urban center would have independence. You couldn't just take over the land.
Right.
Whereas the states copied the federal government in centralization. So centralization with Lincoln begins with the central government, but then it spreads, the cancer spreads to the states. And that's why the cities, they're just corporations. They don't have any reality. Even New York City doesn't have any reality beyond the state legislature.
Well, I am all out of questions. You have been awesome. This has been a brilliant theoretical journey. I really appreciate you being open. A lot of people don't want to go down these theoretical paths, but I'm like, how are we supposed to discuss things that could happen in the future? How are we supposed to be prepared for them if we can't entertain a little bit of theoretical discussion? Yeah. Do you have any questions for us? Is there anything we didn't cover, you wanted to cover, or is there any thoughts that you would like people to think about that they can't get out of?
Well, I think if I had anything, it would be that let's go back to Aristotle. And he says political society, especially if it's Republican, should be small. And if we need defense and commerce, ease of commerce, then we should have federations. But if we have federations, they should not obliterate the sovereignty of the small polities, like Athens and Florence, who created great civilizations. So let's pay attention to size. Let's get worried if things get too big because they become dysfunctional. So in politics. So we should work to restore a human scale to political order as best we can. That would be what I think we should think about. And George Kennan, I'll go back to him in 1993, says that we're just too big and dysfunctional, not because of our ideologies. We're dysfunctional because we're just too big. It can't work. We need to downsize. And so, we should begin a public debate. So I should say, let's continue with this debate.
I love that.
We can learn.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Professor. I'll send you a copy of this. If you would do me a favor, if you know anybody in academia or just a thought leader who might be open to having these discussions, we're trying to keep this going with serious discussions about national divorce. I'd appreciate any recommendations you can give today.
Well, I can mention some now, but I'll send you some email if you like.
Yeah, please. And I really, really appreciate it.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Marcus. I enjoyed it.
All right, I'll send you the video soon. Thank you for the recommendations.
All the best. Thank you.
Okay.